Yeah.
But there's been innumerable times where I've gone through the glossary and been like, oh, there's like a nuance to that specific term, you know, especially when certain concepts seem quite similar.
Yes.
And you're like, I don't understand how these things are actually different.
Yes.
You know, and then you go read the glossary and you're like, oh, okay. So it's actually the this
little aspect.
You know,
there's a sort of constraint on this.
Yes.
It relates to this thing. It is defined in terms of this.
Exactly.
I mean, that is the first step in studying, in my opinion, is when you go and learn a language, what do? You learn first the words of that language. And I think a lot of actuarial students started to struggle with this because things have been easy. They've moved through the 1 + 1 is 2 of never thought about the concepts of like, what does 1 represent? What does plus represent in the world?
Yes.
These are definitions.
Yeah.
Plus, I refer my students to the idea of years ago, like centuries ago, we these sort of mathematical terms were coming out. There's no standardization of how these things worked. And so you had people saying is equal to, or writing various different symbols for it. We just have gotten to a place now where we share 99% of us would likely share the same common understanding of what the symbol means.
Yes.
But in the same way, terms change. So your definitions are the building blocks of maths in English. It's logic. And so when you get into the definitions for the first time, even in your technical subjects, that is the building block. This became very apparent to me, and I think it was in my third year math subject, where we were looking at real analysis, or complex analysis, and I was not here for it. Did not understand what was going on until I went back and I said, what are the definitions here? What are your building blocks? Because then every question is actually just a puzzle you're trying to fit together.
Yes, exactly.
Every word has a definition attached to it. Definitions, or there will be some level of agreement between words or disagreement. Or influences of expenses on reserves. That by definition, those words have attached meanings to them. And so from those meanings, then it's just plug and play. You're looking at similarities between what are the words that are attached here. And then it becomes a lot easier. That is a vastly underrelated thing.
I think also what's quite interesting what you say here is there is a similarity between those technical subjects and the later subjects, in that in the earlier subjects, we're always defining our variables.
Exactly.
Right? And because obviously in your technical subjects, you're mainly working with symbolism and numbers. That still works out in your later exams. It's just you have now, instead of defining a variable, you're defining a term or a product. So the logic is still there. It's just being applied in a different context. And I think the key word for those later exams is context.
Yes.
Because I think that's the key differentiator is that in your later subjects, your questions are always within these contexts, and they try to sort of model in some ways real life context.
Exactly.
And say, well, as an actuarial analyst or as an aspiring actuary, what would you do here?
Yes.
You know, before you get into the practicalities of doing an IBNR, what's the data you need? What are the assumptions you're making? What's actually the nature of the claim or the liability that you are trying to model? And I think it kind of takes you to grassroots. And if done properly, I think it makes you understand the technical subjects better.
1000%, absolutely. I harp on all the time to my undergrads around definitions. Defining your variables. What are you actually working with here? Because that is how things improve. Is so that if we didn't define things, we all just went around with the concept of cat in our head, but not defining what is CAT. Like what is a cat in a shared understanding of things. Then we would never be able to get anything done. Because all of our definitions would clash with one another. Shared communication is by its nature how we've built all of this. Is by an agreed upon thing that future generations can go and reference. And so when you get to those definitions, you are essentially learning all of the history behind this. And so that for me is always the first thing that I'm looking for in a student is have you learned your definitions? Not just parrot. In the beginning, it starts with parrot fashion. It's like how a baby learns to talk. You keep repeating the same word, and eventually they understand that it has context and nuance. But we do this implicitly. And so your sort of memorization of definitions and things do start as memorization, but eventually they embed themselves into understanding 1 + 1. You no longer think about the concept of a unit plus a unit added together. You're thinking about the concept of, well, this is just an addition thing.
Yeah.
You're no longer putting in the effort to try and recall the definition. You just apply the
It's almost like timetables, right? Like in the beginning, you're like, okay, multiplication is like repeated addition. And then when I say to you now, I want to 7 times 8, you're just like, okay, it's 56. Like, I'm not thinking about it. You're like, it's a 56.
No. I mean, I got that for the listeners at home.
But like that's what it becomes. It becomes innate.
Exactly.
But you have to start at building blocks. But I think something I want to kind of move us towards is the role of past papers. Now, I think this is a little bit of a controversial subject because different people approach past papers in very different ways. And I think also differently in the technical subjects as opposed to the later subjects. And let's talk to the role there, because the way that I would understand it, it'll be interesting to see if you agree, is that in the technical subjects, I think past papers, I think it's helpful across the board, but in the technical subjects, it's just practice.
Yeah.
It's trying to get different representations of sort of the underlying technical relationships that you have learned, and say, do I understand the relationship in this context?
Yes.
Am I able to understand the variables at play? And it's just that element of kind of exposure more than anything else. And I also think in that context, you can often do past papers whenever. Like if you've just learned, for example, transforming distributions, you'll go find those questions in a paper and then just do those.
Yes.
But I think in the later subjects, past papers, I always warn students not to start past papers too early.
Yeah.
Because of the interconnected nature of the content.
Yes.
And so what would be your sort of view of using past papers in the later subjects compared to the earlier subjects? Obviously, I've given my view. What would be your view?
So I move my students through what I call the 3 C's of studying. Okay. So we start with condense. Okay. And that is your summaries. That is getting your definitions out the way. So this follows kind of, in broad scopes, Bloom's taxonomy of education, of how do we actually go about learning in the world? Where does learning come?
Yeah.
So the first step being condense, we're learning things. We're learning bookwork. We're learning how to speak the language. The second part comes through application. So consolidation of work. Finding these webs of information. How does this tie into this? Exactly. And testing your knowledge against things to say, I think it sits here. It doesn't sit here.
Yes.
So that is where we're referencing our study material. We're building a compendium of knowledge that we're slowly moving inside ourselves. We're consolidating the information in our heads. And then the last step is call. How do we recall this information in a time-constrained place? And that is where your past papers come in. It's the last step you're doing. You're not really going to be getting a lot of useful information because you're stumbling from the first 2 C's if you're trying past papers. Because you don't even know how to speak the language. It's like giving an English matric paper to a 5-year-old. They're not learning English in that way. We are testing English in that way. And so your past papers are serving as a feedback mechanism. What your brain should be trying to do is you're essentially building this compendium of knowledge, and then you are querying it like a search function.
I love that.
And you're essentially trying to look up. Exactly. And you want to minimize the error of that. How often, so there's 2 places that it could go incorrectly. That when you go and reference your material, it drops you in the wrong place. You are in the wrong chapter. My friend.
You are. Don't see the wood from the tree.
Exactly. There's not even wood here. You're on Arrakis. You're not even on the same line.
And the worms are coming for you.
Exactly. So in terms of that is where you're partially moving from consolidation to calling. What the testing there is just your broad scope to understand where the context of a question is sitting. So I usually find the first thing in past papers that's actually very useful when I do it is, what section is this coming from? Where like talking about trees from forests, what tree am I looking at here? Gives you the trunk of the answer. Because they will allow that.
I'll get you in your say.
And then it's good. We're going to extend the metaphor. So then once you've kind of gotten the trunk down, you understand where you need to be going. Where do the branches grow? And then comes filling in. So there comes, now you're querying the exact details of it. So now we're looking for accuracy and answer. So the first thing we're looking for is just context. The sort of conceptualization of thought, of like, do you understand what we're even asking of you?
So like, what product are we? Is this general insurance? Is this long life? Long term or life insurance? That just became more clear. But that's very important because I often, when I go through a question with a student, I'll read the first sentence where it's like, it's a medium-sized insurer, and it's quite established, and it sells life insurance. And I think, what does that tell you? What does it tell you about the data they have?
Yes.
What does it tell you about the type of liability they have? And students often look at me being like, I think you're reading a bit much into this. You're like English teachers in poetry in high school. Like, that's not what the author means.
Yeah.
They notice, actually, this is what the author means.
Exactly. And I also think students struggle with that because they don't understand the educational journey is climbing the tree. Is that you realize that every tree is different.
Yeah.
In the real world, there is no ideal tree. There's no Platonic concept there's no form that exists as a real tree.
Yeah.
Everyone were to describe a tree, you describe it differently.
Yeah.
And so the next part after you get there is then you're testing the accuracy of your knowledge.
Yeah.
So you're testing the depth of it. But first you have to get to the right place before you start climbing a tree. Otherwise you're climbing a random tree.
Yeah.
And then you're filling in the leaves of it. So there's where your acronyms and things are coming in. Not because you have to learn acronyms, but because acronyms may be a way that speed up this process.
Yeah.
Depending on your brain. So
it's like, and I think also something that's interesting for me with past papers is I always say to students, you shouldn't be using past papers to learn.
Yes.
For me, past papers are to, one, see whether you've consolidated correctly, whether you've connected, right? Just be like, when I'm reading this question, I understand that I have to draw on my product knowledge, I have to draw on my contract design knowledge, I have to draw on whatever. So I'm understanding that I'm pulling from many spaces.
Yes.
And then it's also to test whether you are actually doing it in the correct amount of time.
Yes.
Like that exam technique.
Yes.
Right? And then, you can answer a question and be like, I lost the plot. I need to go over this again. So it can kind of like go from that recall space that you're talking about back to consolidation.
It's all the same.
To be like,
I don't know this definition. Exactly. What is this word? I've never even seen this word before. What is this concept?
Exactly.
And so and this is where I advise students of what we don't want to fall into is the OER method.
Yes.
So
that's exactly what I mean.
Our brains, again, if I go back to the cat and apple example, is you don't think in terms of real world. No. That's why we have anxiety and things, is because the abstract images we build up about these things in our heads are not articulated anywhere. You cannot externalize them into actual words.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening in past papers is you go and do your past paper, then you go and mark your past paper. You still have those abstract images of where you think you are going. You're still picturing images of trees in your head.
Yes.
But the actual tree you've drawn on the paper doesn't even look like a tree.
No, exactly.
You're on a different continent.
It's like those signal towers. It's nothing tree.
Look at my signal. It's so nice. And this is where, and then you were to start marking, and you say, but I would have written that.
Oh, that's what I meant.
But then why didn't you write that?
Yeah, exactly.
And so my suggestion is past papers are here as a reflection. If we get a bit more technical now, the way I kind of visualize it in my head is, if you imagine like a neural network.
Yes.
The first C condensing, all you're doing is figuring out what even needs to be in the network.
Yeah, what's the data and then you feed into this?
The consolidating is you're now joining all of those
nodes.
What needs to be connected to what. The recalling is the hyper optimization.
Yes.
You're
prompting
parameters.
You're prompting and saying, okay, what is coming back? And then you're testing what's coming back and then going back and tweaking the model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you need to add something? Do you need to remove? Do things need to be moved around?
Yes.
So I also recommend to students again, in your way, the way it works for your brain.
Yeah.
The chapters were not written by you. You didn't write the study notes.
Yeah.
So why is chapter 4? It's largely arbitrary. So if chapter 4 doesn't make sense in that place for you, why are you keeping it there?
Yeah.
No one is going to ask you, don't answer these things from chapter 4, because that's not how the world works. And so that compendium of knowledge is yours to take out of the exam, is yours to take into the exam.
Yeah.
And so how that looks is largely up to you.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that I suggest with students. So I mean, in terms of past papers, useful to do as a optimization exercise. And you are optimizing your exam taking ability, and there's different parts that you can get from it, but it is not like an initial study method. You're not going to get the same questions coming time and time again. You are largely going to be applying your knowledge. And that is what you're wanting to work on.
Yeah. I think, there's many other things around past papers, but I think something that is also useful is getting someone else to mark your attempts to past papers, whether that's a peer or whether you're using, for example, Think Actuary, which I think is a fantastic tool just to highlight to listeners, where you can go onto this platform and they've loaded all the past papers for various subjects, and you can practice the questions under exam conditions. There's a timer, you're typing in your answers, and then you can get a qualified actuary to mark it for you.
Exactly.
And so you remove that element of, oh yeah, you know, are they actually no, what are you saying here? Or you can't say it in this way because it actually means something other than what you think it does.
Yes.
Like something I always say to my students is, please never ever use the word will. You can't say this will happen.
Yes.
And like literally it gives me, it gives me like genuine the feels when I see that, because I'm just like, oh, unless you are some sort of genie, how do you know that that will happen? And as an actuary, or as an aspiring actuary, when you say this will happen, as a marker, I'm just like, I cannot give you a stamp of approval.
Yeah.
Because imagine if you were advising a client and you said this